Hi, I'm Rod Hughes, and I'm joined today by Alexa Santoro, Account Executive with Lamb Insurance Services. Alexa, thank you for joining us today.
Rod, thank you for having me. I look forward to speaking on the topic.
Great. And that topic today for us is going to be sexual misconduct related incidents. A heady topic, but Alexa, if you can walk us through some things, I'd like to jump right into the questions. Particularly, and the most important, what are some of the common types of sexual misconduct claims reported by nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, so I would break the types of claims down into three different categories. The first is individual related. So organizations serve individuals, and oftentimes we see sexual misconduct related claims be individual on individual. The second is an employee on an individual served. The last is something that I would say a lot of organizations don't really consider. And one of the secret or kind of ghost situations, and that's third party on individual served. Now third party could really be anyone that enters the organization that's not an employee. Most commonly we see that being a delivery person or a maintenance worker, and they often kind of go unnoticed in the organization. And I would say it's definitely one of the biggest threats, especially when the nonprofit has group homes or any sort of residential or real estate exposure.
And we were talking earlier about the fact that these types of claims are on the rise. Can you talk a little bit about that and what maybe some of the underlying causes or contributing factors may be?
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely say that over the last 12 to 24 months, we've seen an uptick of these types of incidents being reported. First of all, that's really a result of legislative changes. So there have been a number of states, but kind of leading the charge was the state of New York and they added something called the Child Victim Act. The Child Victim Act was something that reduced this or completely removed the statute of limitations for survivors of sexual assault as a child. So essentially, it completely opened the books on any sort of sexual misconduct or sexual assault related incident for an individual regardless of their age. So you could see somebody who's 80 or 100 years old that never reported the incident in the past come out and allege that an incident occurred. That really completely upside down the market. It was something that a lot of insurance carriers felt was no longer exposure because, understanding the statute of limitations and how long a claim could possibly be reported for is something that obviously changes rate and also the insurance carrier's book. Now with the onslaught of new claims being reported, it definitely changes that understanding. Another example of a legislative change is something that was just recently added by the state of New York, and that's the Adult Survivor Act. So even as an adult, now you have 1 year, regardless of when the incident occurred, to come out and, make that incident known and allege that something occurred. Besides legislative changes, I would say that the world and really what's happening socially has heavily impacted whether or not people are willing or able to come out about these incidents. That would, cultural movements like Me Too, the news reporting on these incidents and making it known that, these alleged perpetrators are being put into jail and put behind bars is definitely something that's increased it. Another thing that I would definitely point out is that it's from a social perspective, more acceptable, or the world is more open to listening to survivors. Something that somebody might not have wanted to talk about historically because of how uncomfortable it is to talk about is now, brought out into the open, and it's really making these survivors of these incidents more willing to talk about it, and it's becoming ever prevalent to hear about these incidents now.
So changes in society, changes legislatively, are contributing to a rise in these types of incidents. Can you share some best practices for preventing sexual misconduct related incidents?
Yeah, so I would say that the first thing that an organization should definitely do is understand and be aware of what possibly could happen, right? Exposure. That's, for example, that's if you work with children, understanding that, when an adult or someone else is alone with a child, there's an increase for these types of incidents to possibly occur. The other thing is to make sure that as an organization, you're identifying those exposures and then building policies and procedures to try and avoid those exposures or at least limit them, right? You can't make something not happen, but you're trying to do as best as you can to avoid the issue or to avoid the exacerbation of the issue. So, making sure that your employees, that there are, so making sure that the organization has policies and procedures around abuse related incidents or sexual misconduct related incidents, making sure that all of your employees are trained in those procedures, and then providing a platform for anyone to report those incidents and for retaliation to not exist if they were to report those incidents is what I would really say are the most important in that regard.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about training. It can be so critical in preventing some of these types of incidents, reducing the number of sexual misconduct related incidents. In that regard, what type of training would you recommend an organization that may be struggling with these issues or seeing these types of claims on the rise? What type of training should they employ to mitigate this risk?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that I would most recommend is if you identify that your exposure is child related, you definitely put into place an abuse prevention system called Ministry Safe. Ministry Safe is something that was formed by two attorneys who spent their careers litigating abuse. It's one of the leading vendors in the space, and it's something that we highly recommend at LAM, and our loss control people always recommend it to our clients. And then it's also recommended by many of LAM's primary carriers, including Philadelphia Insurance, Church Mutual, Guide One, and Berkeley Human Services. Basically, what APS or Ministry Safe is it's a way that you can provide sexual abuse awareness training for all clients that are directly exposed or working with children. It has no cost to the organization, and it gives you a way to, or it gives the organization a way to access the training for their employees and then also track who has or hasn't completed their training. If there's no child exposure, or that, because abuse prevention system is really kind of, geared towards the child sector, just developing, policies and procedures around abuse, including, directly identifying and defining what sexual misconduct or sexual assault is in a policy, providing the awareness of the policy and making sure that an employee understands that they can report an incident anonymously with no retaliation. And then as an organization, just really living, breathing, walking and talking a safe environment, and making sure that they're reinforcing the policies and procedures that they've put into place.
Now, Alexa, there may be some folks watching who have been fortunate enough not to have experienced this type of claim or incident before. So for those who haven't and are wondering how it works, could you talk a little bit about what type of coverage would respond to a sexual misconduct related incident? And in addition, what is the current availability of that coverage in the marketplace? And then finally, a third piece, if you could talk about what types of limits would be appropriate or adequate for this type of coverage.
Absolutely. So It's really something that not a lot of people outside of insurance or even in general insurance would think about. Normally, bodily injury or property damage or something like that would be reported under general liability. That general liability policy started to see these sexual misconduct related incidents and said that's really not the intent and that's really not what we want to be covering. And so the insurance industry created a separate line of coverage. There are a few different ways or nomenclatures that are, used for that type, but commonly it's abuse and molestation, sexual misconduct coverage. And essentially what it does is it creates, a separate tower or separate limit that's afforded solely for sexual misconduct related incidents. Unfortunately, because of the uptick of these claims and what we're seeing in the world, the availability of that coverage is extremely limited. Historically, the way that we would kind of structure these types of policies, and it's very similar to how you would structure a liability policy, is you buy primary limits. So let's say that's $1 million per occurrence. And then you buy an additional umbrella over that primary limit. The umbrellas, in the past could really be anything that the organization decided or deemed was what they wanted to cover or limit or provide. Because remember that limit is really deemed or provides the settlement, right? So what is the individual ultimately provided as a way to, give themselves or, make good on that claim. And so you really can't identify, appropriate limit. With that said, you could really have anything from an occurrence perspective, $1 million primary, and then umbrellas could be 10 million, 20 million. With the extreme limiting of the availability of the coverage, we're also seeing a limitation in what's available from an appetite perspective for limit. So insurance carriers that historically would provide a $10 million umbrella are now limiting abuse claims to $5 million in that umbrella, or they're saying we just don't want this exposure and we're going to completely remove it from your coverage. That's really caused the organizations that are buying this limit to have to look elsewhere for coverage. So in terms of adequate or appropriate limits, the way that I kind of counsel my clients is to purchase whatever you really think would you can afford. So is to purchase really what you can afford. Unfortunately, with the limitation and the availability of the limits, it's become very expensive to purchase those limits because there's a limited amount of carriers that are actually willing to offer them. So when we think about how much to buy, obviously we have no idea how much a jury is going to afford an individual that was unfortunately impacted. But we need to think about the assets of the organization and how much is really at stake and try as best we can to insulate those assets.
That's great insight, Alexa. And the last thing I'd like to ask you is something you unfortunately know too well, that despite some of the best risk management practices out there, sexual misconduct related claims can still happen. So what can you say to a nonprofit owner or operator who finds themselves in a situation where there has been a sexual misconduct related claim made? What are some of the steps they need to take, working both with you and to better protect their organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that the first thing that I would definitely counsel my clients is to always take allegations seriously. Something that you don't think could possibly happen can definitely happen, and make sure that you investigate and look into every reported incident. To that end, as you receive an incident, Make sure that you're keeping it, to only the parties that really should know about it, and not spreading it, is definitely something that you want to make sure, because you're not prejudicing the claim. You're not prejudicing any of the available information. The next would really be to report it to whatever authority you're required to report it to. As an organization, you might be overseen by the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities. So you need to report it and follow their reporting structures. You also might, or probably are going to be required to report it to the authorities, the police. They need to get involved. The next thing that I would say is let your insurance agent know. We are often forgotten. And, again, this is very serious. It's a serious case, and you might not think insurance, but at the end of the day, insurance is really what you're using to insulate the assets of the organization. So we need to make sure that we can work with you and guide you and counsel you through the situation, but also so that the carrier can be on appropriate notice and make sure that the carrier knows what they're up against. Next, I would recommend that you do as much discovery as you possibly can. Can you look through the files that are, around that or for that individual? Can you look at the employee's schedule and identify where they were at that time to determine whether or not they might have been, where they've been alleged they were? Can you look at maintenance schedules and determine if there was possibly a maintenance person there at the time? And make sure that you're sharing, obviously, make sure that you're sharing that information with all of the parties involved.
Well, as you said, insurance is often not top of mind, but certainly very important, especially in situations like this. Alexa Santoro with Lamb Insurance Services, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.